Chris, we're really excited to have you here to talk with us about native plants and their impact on the local watershed. So your work is directly involved in that, and I welcome you here today to discuss some of these concepts and principles with native plants. So if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself and tell our viewers a little bit about the work that you do with native plants in our watersheds.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. My name is Chris Cardwell, and I'm the urban conservationist for the Miami County Conservation District. And we sponsor the Hillsdale Watershed Coalition, which, among many other things, is responsible for funneling state and federal resources to agricultural producers to implement best practices like cover crops and no-till farming. But in the urban sphere, we spend a lot of time advocating for the restoration of natural habitat and the protection of urban waterways, which ultimately obviously become part of the larger watershed as a whole. And native plants are a critical piece of that education.
Good, thank you. Okay, so my first question for you today, Chris, why are native plants especially useful for improving waterways?
Well, it is an interesting question about improving waterways, and there's a twofold approach to that. In the urban sphere, our development model has been one of degrading waterways, where we put in a lot of impervious surfaces, we increase the volume of runoff, and we increase the pollutant levels in that runoff. So in many ways, native plants and restoring native ecosystems in these watersheds is a way to not improve per se, but to return to original water quality pre-development. And then in a lot of ways, we have opportunities to conserve and protect existing green spaces in those watersheds. So there's a lot of different implementations of it, but in the ag world, like we were saying in Hillsdale, we advocate for one practice that's called prairie strips. So if a producer like this image indicates would put a buffer along the edge of their farm fields, their cultivated crop fields. Studies have shown through the Strips research team in the Leopold Center that a little buffer along the edge of a farm field keeps 95% of the soil that would run off in place. It keeps about 90% of the phosphorus and about 85% of the nitrogen that runs off of the top of that farm field. It keeps it in place. And so that's an incredible practice. And that research is really showing what the impact of putting in native plant systems, what the impact can be in the ag practice. And anytime you can keep that kind of pollutant load out of our waterways, it's a good deal.
That's remarkable. Thank you for sharing that information. Next question for you, Chris. What is the potential of native plants to preserve our waterways?
Well, it's remarkable. The return of impervious surfaces or the conversion of turf or public areas in our cities to native plantings, or to at least incorporate native buffer strips. Those deep roots not only reduce runoff volumes, but they also improve the quality of the runoff that is coming out of urban and our developed spaces. So it really has everything to do with the root systems of these plants. We'll see an image that will show that the root systems of native plants can descend as far as 10 to 15 feet into the soil, and that creates an entire subsurface rhizosphere, this entire ecosystem below ground, where so much work is done to improve water quality. And that's all taking place on site, wherever these native plants are installed and cultivated.
Amazing. All right. So how can home and business owners use native plants to protect their watersheds?
Well, that's really a powerful question when it comes to talking about Contain the Rain. The Contain the Rain program was designed as an impetus to empower the residents and to empower people in the community to take their own actions because a municipality can design their green spaces and their stormwater infrastructure systems with native plants in mind. But when it comes to the private sphere and the private lands, those are really the bulk of what we have in at least in Kansas and the Kansas City area. So when a homeowner or when a property owner or when a farmer decides to take these practices and implement them in their own land, that's really where the impacts can be magnified. And so, like we saw with that prairie strips infographic, this here in the center, these native plants with their rich root systems, compared to the dominant crop in the American urban landscape, which is a turf grass. This particular Kentucky bluegrass might have rye, we might have a different mix of them, but the story is pretty much the same. The root systems of turf grasses are not deep, they're not resilient, and they're not adapted to the native climate and soils of the Midwest. These are underperforming, very underwhelming plant systems. So when you compare entire lawn or an entire golf course or an entire park or whatever of bluegrass, and you compare that to the root systems of these native plants that can be implemented very easily in strips or in plantings, you see the difference in infiltration capacity, and you see a huge difference in the ecosystem services. We begin then to talk about pollinators, and we haven't really even begun to breach the understanding of what the soil biology is like under a native plant system too. So it's not just the plants and the plant roots that can take up pollutants and can infiltrate stormwater, but it's also the microbial life that supports and all of the work that these little critters in the soil do to help break down hydrocarbons, to help sequester CO2 from the atmosphere and reduce pollution and so on. So when it comes to what you can do in your home, that's what Contain the Rain really has the teeth to empower you to do, by installing these systems in your yard, by flanking your down slope areas of your house, by diverting your downspouts into a rain garden or a native planting. All of these are simple practices that any homeowner can implement very readily, or business owner, commercial opportunities. There's some wonderful businesses in town that are extremely dedicated to sustainability in the watershed. And when you have a larger facility, you can, of course, roll these things out at larger scale. But implementing these practices in a residential setting or in a commercial setting have infinitely more potential to protect the watershed than what a municipality can do by themselves.
Great answer, Chris. Thank you. Yeah, I was looking at that Liatris, the Blazing Star root system, and for we saw a photo of that earlier in the slideshow, and for as beautiful as a plant it is above ground, that root system is quite remarkable. And if I were a little microorganism living in the soil, I would definitely take up house one of those cozy root systems versus some of that turf grass.
That's the truth. And you can see it in practice if you go out into your turf lawn and you just put a spade down a couple inches. You've got maybe 2 to 3 inches of life underneath that grass, and the alternative is much more significant. So when given the opportunity to not completely replace, we all have our need for soccer pitches and ball diamonds and open grassy areas for recreation and picnicking and things, but we can't exclude the native plants from that environment. We need to incorporate a beautiful balance of the two.
All right, so what are some of the benefits of keeping our waterway clean?
Well, it's a very powerful question with some very obvious answers, but then there's some kind of complexities to that too. I would say there's a big picture idea in that the water that's on Earth is all the water that has ever been and will ever be on Earth. And when we find in some of our modern practices that we're finding end uses for water. We're contaminating water to the point where it can never be used for human or animal or plant consumption again. Things like fracking and such. We realize that that's a net negative, and we'd never get that back, or rather at great expense and through technologies that aren't quite realized yet. So there's this big picture where water is a finite resource. And then there's some more localized kind of direct result benefits. So for example, in the Hillsdale watershed, all of the streamways and creeks from Southwest Johnson County within the watershed all flow down into Hillsdale Lake. And they all take with it all of the surface runoff, all of the agricultural inputs that aren't maintained and kept in place through cover crop or no-till practices. And when they all arrive in Hillsdale Lake, we have massive sedimentation issues. We have TMDL problems, nutrient loading. And that is a huge problem because these communities, tens of thousands of residents of these communities actually drink that water. And granted, we're not, in a third world situation where we actually go to the lake with buckets and bring the water home to drink. But the systems that are in place and the treatment facilities and the treatment expenses that come with making that water safe for human consumption again and safe for municipal use, there's great expense at that. So there's a cost benefit to reducing the inputs into our waterways and into our water sources. But then there's also that public health benefit. If we have high nutrient levels in our receiving waters, in our lakes and our ponds, we end up with harmful algal blooms. We end up with great risks to the security and health of the fish and the waterfowl. And those are then loss of recreational opportunities if we can't eat the fish in Hillsdale Lake because of harmful algal blooms. And then at the end of the day, there's, I think a lot of the people that'll be receiving this conversation today, there's a social responsibility benefit. So if you know that at the very least you're doing your little part, you've got your small front yard in the Kansas City urban sphere, and one little piece of it is absorbing the rainwater off of your downspout, or one little piece of it is keeping runoff in place, or is serving to benefit local pollinators and local soil health. That's an individual benefit that you can kind of give yourself a little pat on the back, like we're doing our part.
I agree. You're protecting somebody else's source water downstream. So
yeah,
which is very, very good. Well, Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate all the work that you and Miami County Conservation District are doing to help protect source waters and our waterways, to promote the education and benefits and installation of native plants in our local region. So keep up the good work. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you as well. We'll talk to you soon.